The first thing Corin learned about hunger was that it made you small, son. Small. It pulled you into yourself, made you walk close to walls and step light on floors, made you learn which boards creaked and which ones swallowed a footstep whole. By the time he was 12, Corin knew every quiet inch of the Aldenmere mill. He had lived in its loft for 3 years, since the fever took his grandmother and no one in the village stepped forward. The miller, Bendwick, was not a cruel man, just a practical one. He let the boy sleep above the grinding stones in exchange for sweeping, stacking, and keeping his mouth shut about whatever he happened to see. It was a fair arrangement, as arrangements went when you had nothing to offer but silence. That was why, on the morning, Corin climbed down to the grain shed to sweep it out before first light. He understood at once what the rule was. A large shape in the far corner, green-gray skin, a shallow, unsteady breath, one hand pressed flat to a wound at her side, the rags already dark. He stood in the doorway for a long time. He had heard the talk, same as everyone. An orc woman seen crossing the lowland road 2 nights past, and a village council that voted, quickly, quietly, to send her along if she turned up. Not cruelty, exactly. Just the old frontier wariness that passed for reason when people were frightened enough. He knew what he was supposed to do. Fetch Bendwick. Say he'd found her. Let the council handle the rest. The orc woman opened one eye. Gray-green iris, the color of river water over slate. She looked at him, and she did not move, and she did not beg, and she did not threaten. She just looked. Corin pulled the shed door shut behind him. He went back to the mill loft and broke his own bread in half. He brought it to her before anyone else was awake. He tore cloth from his second shirt, the only other shirt he owned, and folded it into a pad and set it against the wound, and she let him, watching him the whole time with those river-gray eyes and never making a sound. He did not know her name. She did not offer it. That was all right. He wasn't sure she trusted words yet, and he didn't blame her. He fed her for 7 days. Half his bread every morning. Water from the river in the mill's old clay pot. A strip of smoked fish once that he filched from Bendwick's curing shelf and felt terrible about for a week afterward. He learned her habits. She was awake before him every morning, upright and still, turning a small, smooth river stone over in her fingers. Pale gray, round as an egg. She kept it in her palm the way some people kept a worry bead. He never asked about it. She never explained. By the 4th day, she had started watching him differently, not sizing him up the way a wary creature watches an uncertain threat. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, if Corin had to name it at 12 years old, like the careful attention of someone taking very good note. On the 5th day, she spoke. Her voice was low and deliberate, each word placed like a stone in still water. Why, she said. Corin thought about it honestly. Because you were hungry, he said, and I know what that's like. She turned the stone over twice in her palm. She didn't say anything else. On the 7th morning, the shed was empty. The wound cloth was folded neatly in the corner. The clay pot was clean. The smooth stone was gone. Corin swept the shed and went back to the loft and felt, strangely, like a door had shut somewhere. Not painfully, but with the soft, certain click of something finished. He didn't tell anyone. Not then, and not in the years that followed. Life carried Corin through the usual slow arithmetic of a frontier town. He learned joinery from an old craftsman named Hassel, who took him on at 15 and left him the shop tools and the lease when he died 9 years later. Corin was not a remarkable man in any of the ways that towns noticed. He paid his dues, kept his accounts in a battered ledger, repaired chairs and barn doors and the occasional ox cart wheel, and lived alone in the modest yard at the edge of Aldenmere, where Hassel's sign still hung above the door. He had never gotten around to replacing it. He was 32 now, and the workshop leaned to one side in a way that troubled him every spring. The roof needed new shingles. The front beam was soft at one end. He had the skills to fix all of it and not quite the coin, and he had been carrying that arithmetic in the back of his mind for 2 winters without resolution. That was the shape of his life on the morning the peddler came. She was a small woman, road-dusted, with a mule and a cart full of river trade, bolts of cloth, clay beads, dried herbs, and tied bundles. She stopped at Corin's door, not to buy or sell anything, but to set a single object on his counter and look at him. A smooth stone, pale gray, round as an egg. Someone asked me to carry this to the joiner in Aldenmere, the peddler said. The one who slept above the mill as a boy. Corin picked it up. It sat in his palm exactly the way he remembered it, sitting in hers. Who? He said. The peddler was already climbing back onto her cart. She said you'd know, she said, and clicked the mule forward, and was gone before Corin thought to call after her. He set the stone on the workbench beside his chisel and stood there for a long time. The shed. The 7th morning. The empty corner and the folded cloth. The river-gray eyes. He did not sleep well that week. 7 days after the peddler, they came. Corin heard them before he saw them. A low, resonant sound carried on the morning air, something between a drum and a chorus of voices, rhythmic and unhurried. He was in the yard-splitting fence posts when the sound turned the corner of the lane, and he set down his maul and waited. There were 14 of them. Orcs all, broad-shouldered, traveling clothed, unhurried in their pace, not armed for war, armed the way a delegation arms itself, with presence, with bearing, with the quiet authority of people who have come a long distance because something matters. The villagers at the lane's edge pulled back without sound, the old wariness moving through them like a cold draft. At the head of the delegation walked a woman Corin would not have recognized except for two things: the river-gray eyes, and the stone, which she held, briefly in her open palm as she stopped before him, then closed her hand around it and tucked it away. She was older than the shed, of course. Her hair had gone silver, braided back in the stone hollow fashion. He would learn that word later, and she carried herself the way old trees carry themselves, with the settled weight of something that has weathered much and does not expect to be moved easily. The wound was long healed, invisible beneath her traveling coat. She was, he understood immediately and without anyone telling him, someone of consequence. Corin of Aldenmere, she said. Her voice was the same, low, deliberate, each word a stone in still water. That's me, he said, because there was nothing smarter to say. I am Vora, she said, elder peace speaker of the Stone Hollow clan. 20 years ago, a boy with half a loaf of bread made a choice that cost him something and saved my life. I have come to speak of it. The village was very quiet behind him. He could feel it, the held breath of it, the way a crowd goes still when the ground shifts under a story they thought they knew. You didn't need to come so far, Corin said. You were hurt. I had food. Vora looked at him for a moment that had some weight in it. Yes, she said. That is the whole of it, isn't it? She said it as a statement, not a question. A boy who understood that having something someone else needs and choosing to share it is not a complicated calculation. I have thought about that for 20 years. She turned briefly and said something to the 14 behind her in the stone hollow tongue. Low, unhurried, the same cadence as her speaking voice. Then she turned back to Corin. We are craftspeople, she said. My people. We build in stone and timber. We know this work. She tilted her head toward the workshop, toward the leaning wall, and the soft beam and the shingles that had needed replacing for 2 winters. We would like, with your permission, to begin. Corin looked at the workshop. He looked at the delegation. He looked at Vora. Begin what exactly? He said. The corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. Something better than what is leaning there, she said. They worked for 3 weeks. Corin had never seen a crew move the way the Stone Hollow moved. Quiet, purposeful, each person knowing the shape of the task before anyone explained it. They squared the foundation stones first, working from first light without complaint, the sound of mallets and timber a steady rhythm that became, over those 3 weeks, the sound Corin associated with something he could not quite name. Until the morning, a young orc craftsman handed him a finished mortise joint to check and waited, patiently and without condescension, for his judgment, and Corin understood that the word he was looking for was belonging. They rebuilt the workshop beam by beam. They relaid the roof with cedar shingles and replaced the front wall's sill plate and squared the door frame and reset the stone threshold that had been sinking for a decade. They built a second workbench along the east wall and a storage rack for lumber that ran floor to rafter and would hold twice what his old shed ever had. And at the end of the 3rd week, they hung a new sign above the door, not Hassel's name, not Corin's name alone, but a carved piece of oak with 2 names in both the common script and the stone hollow rune form, side by side. Corin stood in front of it for a long time. You didn't have to do this, he said to Vora, who stood beside him with her hands easy at her sides. No, she agreed, but 20 years is a long time to carry a debt, and the Stone Hollow do not carry debts lightly. I didn't feed you to earn something back. I know that, she said quietly. That is precisely why it matters. He thought about the shed. The 7th morning. A 12-year-old boy deciding that a person he'd never met was hungry, and that hunger was a thing he could do something about, and doing it, and asking nothing and keeping the secret for 20 years. It had not felt at the time like anything larger than a hungry morning and a choice. He supposed most large things did not feel large at the time. You said you were a peace speaker, Corin said. The Stone Hollow, you brokered the lowland truce? In the year you would have been 8 years old, Vora said. Yes, it held. A pause. It still holds. He understood then. In the way you understand something that has been true for a long time and only now has all its pieces visible. What the 7 days in the grain shed had meant in the larger accounting, not just a wounded woman and a hungry boy. The tally was wider than that. But Vora did not say so, and Corin did not press, and they stood in front of the new sign in the morning light and let the arithmetic be. That evening, the Stone Hollow delegation made camp at the east edge of town, and for the first time in the memory of anyone in Aldenmere, the village came to them, not in wariness. In curiosity, then in talk, then in the tentative and genuine warmth of people who have decided, against old habit, to be decent. Corin watched it happen from his doorway, a cup of tea warm in his hands. Vora stayed through the winter. The delegation returned south before the first hard frost, but she stayed, helping, mostly, in the way of someone who has made a decision and is settled in it. She gave advice on timber joinery to anyone who asked and did not charge for it. She ate supper with Corin 3 evenings out of 7, and they talked about wood grain and river crossings, and the way weather moved through the gap in the hills, and occasionally about larger things, and occasionally said nothing at all, which is a particular kind of friendship that takes time to build, and, once built, does not need to be maintained loudly. On the last morning of winter, she rose before dawn and stood in the yard for a long time, and Corin found her there when he came out to start the stove. "You'll go in the spring," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," she said. "There is work at home." She turned and looked at him steadily. "The Stone Hollow have a word. It means a person who is not of the blood but is of the hearth, a sworn brother, a belonging." She reached into her coat and held out the smooth river stone, the pale gray one, round as an egg, that had traveled from the grain shed to 20 years of roads and back to his workbench again. "I would like to leave this with you." Corin took it. It was lighter than he expected, and heavier too, the way things are when they carry more than their weight. "All right," he said. She nodded once, the settled particular nod of someone who has completed something she started a long time ago. When spring came, she went south, and the valley road carried her around the bend of the old birch stand and out of sight, and Corin went back to the workshop. The new sign was above the door. The cedar shingles smelled clean in the morning rain. The stone sat on the workbench where it would sit for the rest of his life, beside the chisel, smooth and pale gray in whatever light came through the window. He had been for 32 years a man who slept close to walls. That spring morning he found he did not feel the need to anymore.